The sun rose over Dry Creek like a judge delivering sentence, harsh and without mercy. Clara Morgan stood at the edge of town, her worn boots planted in dirt that hadn't seen rain in 47 days. She counted them all, marking each one with a scratch on the post outside the general store where she worked for room and board. 15 years old, and already she understood that in Texas, survival meant keeping track of what little you had. Even if it was only days without water from the sky, the settlement itself was barely worth the name. 20 buildings clustered around a single dusty street, each one leaning slightly, as if trying to escape the wind. The general store, the blacksmith, the boarding house, the saloon that doubled as everything else when needed. Beyond them stretched endless brown plains, interrupted only by the distant shape of the Thornton Ranch, where green still existed because money could buy what heaven refused to give. Clara had lived in Dry Creek for 3 years, ever since her parents' wagon had broken down on the trail west, and fever had taken them both within a week. The settlement had absorbed her the way dry ground accepts a single drop of rain, without much notice or care. She worked, she survived, she asked for nothing because she'd learned early that nothing was mostly what you got. That morning started like any other. She was sweeping the store's front steps when she heard the horses. 4 riders came down the main street, moving slow, their animals exhausted. Clara recognized them immediately as Thornton ranch hands, by the way they sat their saddles, like men who'd never questioned their right to anything. Behind them, tied to the last horse with rope, stumbled a man barely able to keep his feet. The stranger wore the remains of what had once been decent clothes, now torn and dust-covered. His face was swollen on one side, and he moved with the careful steps of someone fighting pain with every breath. His hands were bound in front of him, the rope cutting into raw skin. But it was his eyes that caught Clara's attention, dark and alert despite everything. Watching the town with the wariness of someone who'd learned the world could turn cruel without warning. The riders stopped in front of the saloon. The lead man, a thick-shouldered brute named Pike who Clara had seen in town before, dismounted and cut the rope holding the stranger. The bound man fell to his knees in the dust, unable to catch himself with his tied hands. Pike laughed, a sound without humor, and the other riders joined in. Clara's hands tightened on her broom handle. She'd seen cruelty before, knew it was sometimes just part of how things were. But something about this felt different, more deliberate. She took a step forward before she could stop herself, then froze when Pike's eyes swept toward her. His gaze was flat, warning, the look of a man who'd crush anything small enough to crush. The saloon keeper, Mr. Hewitt, came out wiping his hands on his apron. He took one look at the scene, and his face went carefully blank, the expression of someone deciding not to see what was right in front of him. Pike spoke loud enough for anyone listening to hear, explaining that they'd caught this drifter, trying to steal water from Thornton land, that he'd been trespassing, that he'd gotten what he deserved. The words had the rhythm of a story told before, polished and ready. Then Pike and his men rode away, heading back toward the ranch, leaving the stranger kneeling in the street with his hands still bound. Clara waited for someone to help, for Mr. Hewitt or the blacksmith or any of the men standing in doorways to step forward. But one by one they turned away, disappearing back into their buildings like prairie dogs retreating to their holes. Within minutes the street was empty except for Clara and the stranger, and the dust that swirled between them in the hot wind. The man slowly raised his head and looked directly at her. His lips were cracked and bleeding, and when he tried to speak, no sound came out. Just that look, asking for something so basic it shouldn't need asking. Clara glanced back at the store, knowing Mrs. Garrett would have words if she abandoned her work. Then she looked again at the stranger, at the way his shoulders shook with the effort of staying upright, and made her choice. She set down her broom and walked toward him, each step feeling like it carried more weight than it should. Behind her she heard a door close sharply, someone's way of saying they wanted no part of what came next. But Clara kept walking, because 3 years ago strangers had helped her when her parents died, had given her a chance when they could have turned away. Maybe that was why she couldn't do the same now. Maybe it was just that she was tired of watching people pretend not to see suffering when it stood right in front of them. When she reached the stranger, she knelt down in the dust beside him, close enough to see the desperation in his eyes, and quietly asked what everyone else had refused to consider. She asked his name and whether she could bring him water. His answer would change everything, though neither of them knew it yet. All they knew was the heat, the dust, and the choice being made in that moment between cruelty and mercy, in a place where such choices mattered more than most people wanted to admit. The stranger's name was Thomas Wright, and he spoke it like a man reminding himself he still existed. Clara brought him water from the pump behind the store, stealing it in cupped handfuls because she had no bucket she could take without permission. He drank desperately, water running down his chin and darkening the dust on his shirt. His hands still bound, he had to lean forward to reach her palms, the gesture making him look like an animal, which Clara suspected was exactly what Pike had intended. She worked at the ropes with her fingers, but they'd been tied by someone who knew their business, the knots pulled tight and positioned where they'd be hardest to reach. Thomas watched her struggle, then quietly suggested she find a knife. His voice was rough from thirst and something else, maybe from shouting that no one had listened to. Clara nodded and slipped back toward the store, her heart beating faster now that she'd committed to helping. Mrs. Garrett stood in the doorway, arms crossed, her face set in lines of disapproval that had deepened over years of finding fault with everything. She was a widow who'd inherited the store from her late husband and seemed to blame the world for making her run it. When she saw Clara, her mouth thinned even further, if such a thing were possible. The words that followed were quiet but sharp, each one designed to cut. Mrs. Garrett said that Clara should know better than to involve herself with trouble, that the Thorntons owned half the land around Dry Creek and held water rights that kept the settlement alive during dry seasons like this one. She said that drifters came and went, but people who lived here had to think about consequences, about what happened when you angered men with power. She said all this while Clara stood silent, knowing that arguing would change nothing, that Mrs. Garrett's fear was probably justified, but unable to make herself care enough to stop. Finally, Clara simply asked for a knife to cut some rope. Mrs. Garrett stared at her for a long moment, something shifting in her expression, perhaps a memory of a time when she too had been young enough to choose principle over safety. Then she turned and retrieved a small folding knife from behind the counter, pressing it into Clara's hand with a whispered warning to be quick and quiet about whatever foolishness she was planning. Back in the street, Clara cut through the ropes binding Thomas's wrists. He rubbed feeling back into his hands, wincing as blood returned to fingers that had been tied too long. Up close, Clara could see he was younger than she'd first thought, maybe mid-20s, with the kind of lean frame that came from working hard and eating light. His face, beneath the bruises and dust, had an honest quality that was hard to fake, the look of someone who'd spent their life trying to do right by people, even when it cost them. Thomas thanked her with genuine warmth, the kind that made Clara uncomfortable because she wasn't used to gratitude for doing what seemed obvious. He explained that he'd been traveling through looking for work when he'd stopped at a creek to water his horse. He hadn't known it was Thornton land, hadn't seen any fences or signs, but Pike and the others had appeared within minutes, accusing him of stealing what they claimed belonged to their boss. When Thomas had tried to explain, they'd decided explanation was the same as argument, and argument deserved punishment. The story matched what Clara had suspected, the kind of casual injustice that happened when some people had everything and others had nothing, and the law was too far away to ask questions. She helped Thomas to his feet, steadying him when he swayed, and guided him to the narrow alley between the store and the boarding house where they'd be less visible from the street. He needed rest and food, but both of those required safety, and safety was suddenly hard to guarantee. They sat in the shade of the buildings, hidden from casual view, and Clara shared the biscuit she'd saved from breakfast. Thomas ate slowly, like someone who'd learned to make small amounts last. Between bites he asked about Dry Creek, about the Thorntons, about why everyone had turned away when they'd left him in the street. His questions weren't accusations, just the wondering of someone trying to understand a place he'd stumbled into without meaning to. Clara found herself talking more than she usually did, explaining how Dry Creek existed only because the Thornton Ranch allowed it to, how the settlement drew water from a well on land the Thorntons technically owned but hadn't yet decided to close off. She described how people here lived in the space between permission and prohibition, how they'd learned to be invisible when it mattered, to look away from things that might require them to take sides. It wasn't courage they lacked, she said quietly, but options. When you had nothing, You couldn't afford to risk even that. Thomas listened, and when she finished, he asked what she planned to do next. The question surprised Clara because she hadn't thought that far ahead, had only known she couldn't leave him tied and helpless in the street. Now, with the immediate crisis past, she faced the harder question of what came after Mercy. What happened when you made yourself visible, doing something others had chosen not to see? Before she could answer, footsteps approached the alley. Both of them tensed, but it was only Mr. Hewitt from the saloon, looking nervous and checking over his shoulder. He thrust a cloth bundle at Clara, muttering that it held some bread and dried meat, enough for a day or two. He said nothing else, asked no questions, and left as quickly as he'd come, as if even this small kindness required speed to accomplish, before courage failed. Clara looked at the bundle, then at Thomas, and realized that others were watching too, that her choice had given them permission to help in small ways, secretly, without having to stand openly against power they couldn't challenge. It was something, even if it wasn't enough. But what would be enough? What came next? Thomas met her eyes and said what they were both thinking. He needed to leave Dry Creek, needed to get moving before Pike came back, or word reached the Thorntons that someone had cut him loose. Clara nodded, knowing this was the smart choice, the safe choice, the end of the story. But even as she prepared to say goodbye, a rider appeared at the end of the street, sitting still and watching the town with an intensity that suggested the story was far from over. Clara's chest tightened as she recognized the figure. It was Catherine Thornton herself, the ranch owner's daughter, and she was staring directly at the alley where they hid, as if she'd known exactly where to look. Catherine Thornton dismounted from her horse with practiced ease, moving like someone who'd spent more time in saddles than chairs. She was perhaps 20 years old, dressed in riding clothes that were practical but made from fabric that cost more than most people in Dry Creek earned in a month. Her dark hair was pulled back severely, and her face held the kind of careful composure that came from growing up watching every expression for what it might reveal. She tied her horse outside the saloon and walked directly toward the alley where Clara and Thomas waited, frozen in indecision. Clara's mind raced through possibilities, each one worse than the last. If Catherine had come to finish what Pike started, there was nothing to stop her. If she'd come to drag Thomas back to the ranch for punishment, no one in Dry Creek would intervene. Power in this part of Texas was measured in water rights and land deeds, and the Thorntons held both in quantities that made them untouchable. Clara positioned herself slightly in front of Thomas, a foolish gesture that wouldn't stop anything but felt necessary anyway. Catherine stopped at the alley entrance, her eyes moving from Clara to Thomas and back again. When she spoke, her voice was level and direct, without the cruelty Clara had braced for. She said she'd heard what Pike had done, that she'd been in town on other business and witnessed the end of it. She asked if the man was injured beyond the obvious, if he needed medical attention. The questions were practical, almost clinical, as if she were assessing damage to property rather than harm to a person. But there was something in how she stood, a tension in her shoulders, that suggested the clinical tone was armor against something else. Thomas answered carefully, saying he'd heal given time and rest, thanking her for her concern with the wariness of someone who'd learned that power could be polite right up until it crushed you. Catherine nodded, still watching them both with an intensity that made Clara uncomfortable. Then she did something unexpected. She reached into her jacket and pulled out a small leather pouch, holding it out toward Thomas. Inside, Clara could see coins, more money than she earned in several months. Catherine explained that Pike and his companions had acted without her father's knowledge or permission, that what they'd done violated her family's code, even if it hadn't violated any law. She said the money was compensation for the assault and the loss of his time, enough to get him somewhere else with something to start over with. Her words were formal, almost rehearsed, as if she'd prepared this speech on the ride into town. But her hand shook slightly as she held out the pouch, betraying emotion her face refused to show. Thomas stared at the money like it might bite him. Clara understood his hesitation. Accepting payment meant accepting a version of events where what happened was just a mistake, an excess of enthusiasm from hired hands rather than the calculated cruelty it had actually been. It meant agreeing to leave quietly, to forget, to let power buy its way out of consequences, but it also meant survival, meant food and shelter, and the chance to move beyond this dusty settlement where he'd been left to suffer. Before Thomas could respond, Catherine turned to Clara, and her carefully maintained composure cracked just slightly. She asked Clara's name, then said she remembered seeing her around town, remembered hearing she'd lost her parents on the trail west. The acknowledgement was simple, but it carried weight. The recognition of one person who'd suffered speaking to another. Catherine's next words came quieter, almost reluctant, as if she were revealing something she shouldn't. She said that her father, Marcus Thornton, hadn't always been the man he was now. Years of fighting for water, fighting neighboring ranches, fighting the railroad and the government and the weather had hardened him into someone who saw compassion as weakness. Pike and men like him were symptoms of that hardening, enforcers who'd learned to anticipate what their boss wanted and deliver it without being asked. Catherine claimed she was trying to change things, trying to remind her father of the man he'd been before power had twisted him, but progress was slow and setbacks were frequent. Clara listened, caught between skepticism and the desire to believe someone with power might actually want to use it differently. She'd heard stories about Catherine Thornton, whispers that she'd argued with her father about water rights, about treatment of workers, about the casual violence men like Pike inflicted in the Thornton name. But stories were cheap, and actions mattered more. Right now, Catherine was offering money to make a problem disappear, which wasn't the same as preventing problems from happening in the first place. Thomas finally spoke, his voice steady despite the exhaustion that pulled at his features. He said he appreciated the gesture, but couldn't accept money for being attacked, that doing so would feel too much like agreeing that payment settled the matter. What he wanted, what he needed, was just safe passage out of the area without Pike or anyone else coming after him again. He wanted Catherine's word that this was over, that he could leave without looking over his shoulder for Thornton revenge. Catherine considered this, and something shifted in her expression, a flash of what might have been respect or surprise. She nodded slowly and gave her word, explaining that she had authority over ranch security and could guarantee that Pike would be disciplined for exceeding his bounds. She promised Thomas could leave safely, could take the North Road without interference. Then she added something that made both Clara and Thomas straighten in attention. She said that if Thomas wanted work, honest work with fair pay, there was a position available at the ranch. The previous stable master had left, and they needed someone who knew horses and could be trusted with responsibility. The offer was genuine, spoken without the patronizing tone of someone doing charity, just a straightforward proposition of employment in exchange for labor. Catherine explained that she was trying to hire different kinds of people, trying to build a crew that might eventually balance out men like Pike, though she admitted progress was frustratingly slow. The offer hung in the dusty air between them, complicated and tempting and dangerous all at once. Clara watched Thomas wrestle with it, seeing the war between his desire to escape and his need for something more stable than drifting. She understood that tension perfectly, the way survival sometimes meant swallowing pride, accepting help from sources that made you uncomfortable. Before the silence could stretch too long, Catherine added one final detail that changed everything. She said that her father was planning to claim the well that supplied Dry Creek, that within weeks he'd fence it off and charge fees for water access that most people here couldn't afford. She said she'd argued against it, lost the argument, and was now trying to find ways to soften the impact. If Thomas took the job, if he became someone Catherine could trust on the ranch, he might be positioned to help when the water crisis came. He might be able to influence how things unfolded, to protect people who'd be hurt by her father's decision. Catherine's eyes moved to Clara as she said this, and Clara felt the weight of being seen, of being included in plans made by people with power. It was uncomfortable and thrilling and terrifying all at once, the sense that maybe her choice to help Thomas had opened a door to something larger than either of them. But doors opened both ways, and what came through them wasn't always welcome. Thomas looked at Clara, asking without words what she thought, whether this was opportunity or trap. Clara looked back at Catherine, at the tension in her shoulders and the careful hope in her eyes, and made a decision that surprised her even as she spoke it. She asked Catherine what would happen to the people of Dry Creek when the water fees came. Catherine's answer, honest and painful, would determine everything that followed. She admitted that many would leave, that the settlement would likely shrink to almost nothing, that her father saw this as unfortunate but necessary for protecting Thornton interests. Unless, she added carefully, someone found a way to change his mind. The words settled over them like dust, and in that moment, Clara understood that this wasn't just about Thomas anymore, wasn't just about one act of mercy in a street. This was about a whole town balanced on the edge of survival, about people who'd been invisible, finally being forced into view. And somehow, impossibly, she and Thomas had stumbled into the center of it, two people with nothing being asked to matter in ways that seemed too large for them. But maybe that was how change always started, with people who had nothing deciding they couldn't afford to lose even that. Thomas met Clara's eyes, took a deep breath, and gave Catherine his answer. The storm that was coming had just found its first participants, and Dry Creek would never be quite the same again. Thomas accepted Catherine's offer, but with conditions that surprised everyone, including Clara. He said he'd work at the Thornton Ranch, but only if he could spend his free time helping the people of Dry Creek prepare for whatever came next. He wanted freedom to move between the ranch and the settlement, wanted Catherine's promise that she wouldn't use his employment as leverage against the town. Most importantly, he wanted her commitment to work with him on finding alternatives to her father's water plan, to genuinely try changing things rather than just softening inevitable harm. Catherine agreed after only brief hesitation, and Clara recognized something in that quick acceptance. This young woman had been waiting for allies, for people willing to risk something to help her push back against her father's hardening heart. Thomas's conditions weren't demands she needed to negotiate. They were exactly what she'd hoped for, but hadn't known how to ask. The alliance forming between them was fragile, built on hope more than trust, but it was real. Clara felt herself being pulled into it, becoming part of something larger without quite meaning to. Over the next 2 weeks, patterns emerged that changed the rhythm of Dry Creek. Thomas worked days at the ranch, learning the operation, and earning Catherine's trust by proving himself capable with horses and honest in his dealings. Evenings he returned to town and met with Clara and a slowly growing group of residents who decided that preparing for crisis was better than waiting for it to strike. They gathered in the back room of the general store, where Mrs. Garrett had grudgingly given them space after Clara convinced her that planning was safer than panic. The meetings started small, just Thomas, Clara, Mr. Hewitt from the saloon, and the blacksmith named Jonas, who'd been silent during Thomas's ordeal but felt guilty enough to want to make amends. They discussed options that ranged from desperate to unlikely, trying to find solutions where none seemed to exist. Could they dig their own well? Jonas explained that digging deep enough to reach water would require equipment and expertise they didn't have. Could they collect rainwater? Mr. Hewitt pointed out that rain hadn't fallen in nearly 2 months, and the previous summer had been just as dry. Could they negotiate with other ranches for water access? Thomas, who'd learned the local politics working at Thornton's, explained that the other large landowners were watching to see if Marcus Thornton could successfully monetize water rights, planning to do the same if he succeeded. Clara listened to these discussions with growing frustration, feeling like they were circling problems without finding solutions. She'd never thought of herself as someone who took charge, had spent most of her life trying to be invisible enough that people forgot to burden her with expectations. But something about these meetings, about watching adults struggle with questions that affected everyone, pulled words from her she hadn't known she'd been holding. She asked what would happen if they simply refused to pay the water fees, if the whole town collectively said no and dared the Thorntons to cut them off completely. The silence that followed was heavy with consideration. Mr. Hewitt finally spoke, pointing out that refusal would likely mean the Thorntons calling in the sheriff from the county seat, using legal mechanisms to enforce property rights that the law would support. Jonas added that even if they could win a legal fight, which was unlikely, they'd need money for lawyers and time for court proceedings, and people in Dry Creek had neither. Thomas nodded at these objections, but suggested there might be a middle path, a way to make refusing the fees look like something other than simple defiance. His idea came from conversations he'd had with Catherine, who'd mentioned that her father's water claim rested partly on documents from years back. Agreements made when Dry Creek was first settled. If those documents could be found and examined, there might be language in them that protected the settlement's access, obligations the Thorntons had agreed to, that current leadership was ignoring or had forgotten. It was a slim hope, but it was something concrete to pursue, a path that didn't require resources they didn't have. Clara volunteered to search for the documents, reasoning that as someone who worked in the general store and had time between tasks, she could ask questions without arousing suspicion. Mrs. Garrett might remember where old settlement papers were kept, or know who'd been around long enough to have copies. It was a small role, but a clear one, and Clara felt relief at having something specific to contribute rather than just watching others strategize. The next few days, Clara became an informal historian of Dry Creek, talking to old-timers and asking about the settlement's founding. She learned that the town had started as a stage stop, that the well had been dug by a company planning to establish regular service through the area. When the stage routes shifted and the company abandoned the stop, the well had remained and people had clustered around it gradually, building the settlement one structure at a time. But who owned the well? Who had rights to it? Those questions had never seemed important when water was simply there and no one was trying to control it. Finally, Mrs. Garrett remembered that the original stage company papers might be filed at the county land office, 2 days right away. She also admitted reluctantly that she'd been avoiding thinking about the water situation because facing it meant acknowledging how precarious their existence had always been. Clara understood that fear, the desire to not look too closely at foundations that might not hold weight. But they were past the point where ignorance provided protection. Thomas volunteered to ride to the county seat and search the land records using a free day Catherine had given him. Clara wanted to go with him, but Mrs. Garrett's expression made clear that abandoning work for multiple days would end Clara's employment, and she couldn't afford that consequence. So Thomas went alone, promising to be back within 3 days, and Clara waited with the rest of the settlement for news that might change everything or confirm their worst fears. While Thomas was gone, something happened that shifted the dynamics in ways no one had anticipated. Pike appeared in Dry Creek with several ranch hands, not threatening but conspicuously present, drinking in the saloon and making comments loud enough to be heard about loyalty and consequences. He never mentioned Thomas directly, never said anything actionable, but the message was clear. The Thorntons knew about the meetings, knew people were organizing and were watching to see what came next. Catherine's protection had limits, and those limits were becoming visible. Clara felt the fear that settled over the settlement, like dust after wind. The way people suddenly found reasons not to gather, not to talk where they might be overheard. She understood the impulse to retreat, to become invisible again, and hoped that invisibility meant safety. But she also remembered Thomas tied in the street, remembered the way everyone had turned away, and knew that retreating now meant accepting that some people could be cruel without cost, while others absorbed that cruelty without recourse. She'd spent 3 years surviving by being invisible, and she was tired of surviving that way. So Clara did something that felt both necessary and terrifying. She walked into the saloon where Pike sat with his men, asked Mr. Hewitt for a glass of water in her clearest voice, and drank it standing at the bar, while Pike watched with obvious amusement. She didn't say anything provocative, didn't challenge anyone directly, just occupied space she'd normally avoid and refused to let intimidation make her leave. It was a small gesture, almost meaningless, but Pike's expression shifted from amusement to something harder, recognition that invisibility was ending, and visibility meant people who'd been easy to ignore might become complicated to dismiss. When Thomas returned 2 days later, dusty and exhausted, but carrying papers in his saddlebag, Clara met him at the edge of town with news that the landscape had changed while he was gone. They had documents now, evidence that might support their cause, but they also had attention from people who preferred when problems stayed quiet and compliance came without question. The balance between hope and danger had shifted, and Clara couldn't tell which way it would ultimately fall. But as Thomas unfolded the papers and began to explain what he'd found, Clara realized they were committed now, visible and vulnerable and impossibly important in ways that both frightened and energized her. The story was no longer about one man's mercy or one girl's choice, but about a whole settlement discovering that survival sometimes required risk, and that silence had costs that became unbearable. The documents Thomas brought back told a story that was both promising and complicated, the kind of truth that helped and hindered in equal measure. The original stage company papers showed that when the well was dug, an agreement had been filed granting public access to the water for any settlement that formed around the stop. The language was clear enough that a lawyer might build a case on it, but there were problems. The stage company had dissolved decades ago, and the land the well sat on had changed hands multiple times, eventually ending up in Thornton ownership through a series of purchases that blurred original intentions under layers of later transactions. Clara listened as Thomas explained these details to the gathered group, which had grown bravely larger despite Pike's intimidation, now including the boarding house owner, several families from the outskirts, and even Mrs. Garrett, who stood in the back with her arms crossed, but her attention focused. The question facing them was whether an agreement made by a defunct company regarding land now owned by someone else still carried legal weight. Thomas admitted he didn't know, that they'd need a lawyer to interpret the documents properly, but lawyers cost money and time, and the Thorntons would have both in greater supply. Mr. Hewitt posed the question everyone was thinking. If they couldn't win a legal fight, what were they actually planning to do with these papers? Were they just making themselves feel better by finding evidence that ultimately couldn't help them? His tone wasn't dismissive but genuinely uncertain, the wondering of someone who wanted to believe there was a path forward but couldn't quite see it through the dust and difficulty. Catherine Thornton provided an unexpected answer. She appeared at the meeting uninvited but not unwelcome, having heard from Thomas about what they'd found. Her presence made several people uncomfortable, the instinctive wariness of having someone connected to power sitting in on conversations about resisting that power. But she came with information that changed calculations. She explained that her father wasn't actually eager to enforce water fees, that he'd proposed the plan primarily as a response to pressure from other ranchers, who felt the Thorntons were being too generous by allowing free access. If there were legitimate legal questions about ownership and access rights, that gave Marcus Thornton an excuse to delay implementation while things were sorted out, a way to save face with his peers while not actually changing the status quo. The revelation shifted the mood in the room from desperation to cautious possibility. They didn't need to win a court case, they just needed to create enough legal uncertainty that doing nothing became the easier choice for Marcus Thornton than pushing forward. The documents Thomas had found might be enough to accomplish that, especially if presented properly. Catherine offered to raise the questions with her father herself, to suggest that implementing fees while ownership was in doubt could expose the ranch to legal challenges that would be expensive and time-consuming, even if the Thorntons ultimately prevailed. Clara watched the adults process this information, saw hope warring with skepticism on faces that had learned not to trust easy solutions. She understood their hesitation, knew that Catherine's help came with the implicit reminder that they were dependent on someone else's goodwill, someone who could change their mind or be overruled by a father who'd proven himself ruthless when his interests were threatened. But she also recognized that perfect solutions didn't exist, that sometimes you worked with the options available rather than waiting for ideal circumstances that never arrived. Jonas the blacksmith asked Catherine the question that needed asking. Why was she helping them? What did she gain from protecting Dry Creek's water access when her family's interests pointed toward control and profit? Catherine's answer came slowly, as if she were figuring it out as she spoke. She said she'd grown up watching her father become someone she barely recognized, someone who measured worth in acres and water rights rather than relationships and community. She'd seen how isolation had grown alongside his power, how the ranch had become a fortress, and everyone outside its boundaries had become either tools or threats. She admitted she wasn't sure she could change her father's fundamental nature, but she thought she might be able to influence specific decisions, might be able to remind him occasionally of the man he'd been before loss and struggle had hardened him. Her mother had died years back, and something in Marcus Thornton had died with her, a softness that had balanced his strength. Catherine was trying to fill that gap, trying to be the voice that argued for mercy and complexity in a world her father increasingly saw in simple terms of conquest and control. The honesty in Catherine's words created something fragile but real. A sense that despite differences in power and circumstance, they were all trying to navigate systems larger than themselves, trying to find ways to be decent in a world that didn't always reward decency. Clara felt the group shift from seeing Catherine as an enemy, who might become an ally, to seeing her as someone caught in her own struggles, someone whose help was genuine even if it came with limitations. Thomas proposed a plan that drew on everyone's contributions. He would continue working at the ranch, building trust and demonstrating competence, so that when Catherine raised questions about the well, she could point to him as an example of how maintaining good relationships with Dry Creek served Thornton interests. Clara would work with Jonas and Mr. Hewitt to document the settlement's history, gathering evidence of continuous public use of the well that would strengthen their claim to access rights. Catherine would look for other documents in the ranch's records, anything that showed prior Thornton acknowledgement of the settlement's water rights. Most importantly, they needed to move carefully and appear non-threatening. If Marcus Thornton thought he was being challenged directly, his pride would demand he push forward, regardless of legal complications. But if the questions were raised as concerns, as matters his daughter thought he should consider before proceeding, there was a chance his natural caution about expensive legal tangles would make him pause long enough for better solutions to emerge. The plan was modest, full of uncertainty, dependent on variables they couldn't control. But it was something, a series of actions they could take rather than just waiting for crisis to arrive. The meeting ended with cautious determination, replacing the fear that had dominated earlier gatherings. People left quietly, still aware that visibility carried risks, but no longer quite so alone in facing those risks. Clara walked Thomas back toward the edge of town, where his horse waited for the return ride to the ranch. She asked if he thought their plan would actually work, if documents and careful conversations could really change the mind of someone like Marcus Thornton. Thomas admitted he didn't know, that the only thing he was certain of was that doing nothing guaranteed failure, while trying at least created possibility. Sometimes, he said, you had to act on uncertain hopes because certain despair was unbearable. The words stayed with Clara as she watched him ride away into the dusk, as she returned to her small room above the general store and lay awake thinking about the strange path that had led from one morning's choice to helper E, stranger to this moment of standing against power with nothing but words and witnesses. She thought about her parents, about how they'd believed the West offered chances for new beginnings, for building lives that mattered. 3 weeks passed in a tension that felt like waiting for thunder after seeing lightning. Clara continued her work at the general store, but now she paid attention to conversations she'd previously ignored, listening for news from the ranch, for hints about Marcus Thornton's thinking, for any indication that their quiet resistance was having effect, or simply making things worse. The settlement held its breath collectively, people going about daily routines while watching the horizon for signs of the storm they'd invited. Thomas reported back in careful increments, sharing what he observed without drawing conclusions that might prove premature. Marcus Thornton had received Catherine's concerns about the well's ownership history with the gruff attention he gave most things his daughter said, neither dismissing nor embracing her points. He'd assigned his foreman to review the documents, to consult with the ranch's occasional legal advisor about potential complications. The fact that he hadn't simply dismissed the matter outright felt significant, though whether it represented genuine reconsideration or merely tactical delay remained unclear. During this waiting period, something unexpected happened in Dry Creek. The settlement began functioning differently, more deliberately. People who'd previously kept to themselves started coordinating efforts, sharing resources, planning collectively for scenarios that ranged from best to worst outcomes. Jonas organized a group to maintain the well and the pump mechanism, ensuring that if access became contested, they could demonstrate they'd been proper stewards of the resource. Mr. Hewitt started keeping detailed records of water usage, showing patterns that proved the settlement's dependence wasn't wasteful, but necessary for survival. Mrs. Garrett allowed the store to become an informal gathering place, where information could be shared and strategies discussed. Clara found herself at the center of these efforts not through seeking leadership, but through being present and willing to help with whatever needed doing. She carried messages between households, helped document the settlement's history by talking with older residents, assisted Jonas with well maintenance even though the work left her exhausted and dusty. She discovered that action, even uncertain action, felt better than the passive waiting she'd done for 3 years, surviving without quite living. The orphan girl who'd tried to be invisible was becoming visible in ways that both terrified and energized her. Pike continued making appearances in town, but his demeanor had shifted subtly. He still projected menace, still made his presence felt as reminder of Thornton power, but he stopped just short of actual threats, as if he'd received instructions to watch rather than provoke. Clara interpreted this as evidence that Catherine had some influence over ranch operations, that her position wasn't merely decorative, but carried actual authority when she chose to exercise it. The realization made their alliance feel more substantial, less like desperate hope and more like genuine collaboration. The turning point came on an afternoon when the wind carried the first real promise of rain in months, clouds gathering on the horizon with unusual thickness. Catherine rode into Dry Creek and asked Thomas and Clara to meet her at the well, away from buildings where conversations might be overheard. When they arrived, her expression was carefully neutral, the look of someone delivering news that required interpretation rather than immediate reaction. Marcus Thornton had made his decision. He would not implement water fees for Dry Creek, but not because he'd accepted their legal arguments or been moved by appeals to fairness. Instead, he'd concluded that the complications weren't worth the relatively small revenue the fees would generate, especially balanced against the goodwill costs of being seen as someone who'd cut off a struggling settlement from basic necessities. Catherine's careful presentation had given him a way to frame retreat as strategic choice rather than forced concession, and his pride could accept that framing where it couldn't have accepted defeat. The news should have felt like complete victory, but Catherine's expression warned that celebrations would be premature. She explained that her father had attached conditions. The settlement would need to formalize its relationship with the ranch, acknowledging Thornton ownership of the land while securing guaranteed access to the well. This meant paperwork, meant making official what had previously existed in the informal space between property and community. It meant accepting that their water came through permission rather than right, even if that permission was now documented and harder to revoke. Thomas asked the question that mattered most. What happened if Marcus Thornton changed his mind? If future decisions or different leadership decided to implement fees after all? Catherine answered honestly that the agreement she'd negotiated included provisions making such changes difficult, but not impossible, that they'd bought security, but not permanence. Nothing was permanent in Texas except the dust and the struggle, she added with a slight smile that acknowledged the limitation of what they'd achieved. Clara listened to these explanations and felt emotions she couldn't quite name, a mixture of relief and frustration, and something else that might have been growing up. They'd fought for their home and secured it, but in ways that reminded them the security came with dependencies, with acknowledgement that some people had power and others had permission. It wasn't the clean victory stories promised, wasn't the triumph of justice over might. It was the messy compromise of real life, where you took what you could get and built on it as best you could. The three of them stood by the well as the first drops of rain began falling, sparse but real, breaking the long drought with timing that felt almost symbolic. Clara looked at Thomas, who'd stayed when he could have left, who'd chosen involvement over safety because mercy had costs he was willing to pay. She looked at Catherine, who'd used her power to complicate rather than enforce her father's will, who'd proven that privilege could sometimes be deployed toward protection rather than control. And she thought about her own transformation, about the girl who'd swept steps and tried to disappear, becoming someone who stood visible at the center of her community's struggles. Rain fell harder now, and Catherine laughed suddenly, the sound surprising and genuine, breaking the tension that had held them all rigid. She said something about Texas always having a sense of drama, about how the land waited until moments mattered most to provide what it had been withholding. Thomas joined the laughter, and Clara found herself smiling despite everything, despite the imperfect victory and the uncertainties that remained. They'd changed something, had made their small corner of the world slightly better through effort and alliance, and if that wasn't everything, it was still more than they'd started with. Over the following weeks, the settlement adjusted to its new status. Papers were signed, agreements were formalized, and Dry Creek became officially what it had always been informally, a community surviving on the edges of larger powers, dependent and autonomous in equal measure. Thomas continued working at the ranch, but spent more time in the settlement, becoming a bridge between two worlds that needed bridges more than they needed walls. Catherine visited more frequently, joining the community in small ways that suggested she was building something for herself too, finding purpose in connection rather than isolation. Clara remained at the general store but with different understanding of her place. Mrs. Garrett, in a rare moment of direct acknowledgement, told her that courage wasn't always loud, that sometimes it looked like an orphan girl deciding to be visible when invisibility was safer. The words meant more coming from someone who'd spent years choosing caution, who understood exactly what visibility cost and chose finally to value it anyway. The rains continued sporadically through the following weeks, not enough to end all concerns, but sufficient to ease the immediate crisis. The settlement bloomed modestly, people planting small gardens, children playing in muddy streets, life expanding into spaces that drought had compressed. Clara watched these small resurrections and thought about resilience, about how people survived by adapting and connecting, by finding ways to matter even when systems seemed designed to make them irrelevant. On an evening several months after Thomas had been left in the dust to die, Clara stood at the edge of Dry Creek, watching the sunset paint the plains in colors that made harsh land look beautiful. Thomas joined her, his presence comfortable now rather than surprising, and they watched in silence as the day ended and the first stars appeared. He asked if she'd ever thought about leaving, about using the connections they'd built to find opportunities elsewhere, in places where survival didn't require constant negotiation with power. Clara considered the question honestly. She admitted that leaving had appeal, that starting fresh somewhere new carried romantic possibility. But she'd learned something during their struggle, something about the difference between running toward opportunity and running away from difficulty. Dry Creek wasn't perfect, wasn't even particularly good much of the time, but it was hers in ways that nowhere else could be. She'd helped save it, had become visible in its survival, and that visibility meant she belonged here, not through accident of where her parents' wagon had broken down, but through choice and effort, and the bonds formed when people fought together for things that mattered. Thomas nodded, understanding, saying he'd come to similar conclusions, that the ranch job had become more than just employment, but actual purpose, a place where his work contributed to something larger than his own survival. They'd both found what people came west looking for, he suggested. Not wealth or adventure, but the chance to matter, to build lives that had meaning beyond simple endurance. The story could have ended there, with hard-won stability and lessons learned, with Clara and Thomas and Catherine having changed their small corner of Texas in modest but real ways. But as they stood watching the stars emerge, a rider appeared on the horizon, moving fast toward the settlement, and Clara felt the familiar tension return, the awareness that peace was always temporary and new challenges were never far away. The rider turned out to be bringing news about railroad expansion plans, about new developments that would bring different pressures and possibilities to Dry Creek, and Clara understood that their story wasn't ending, but evolving, that the struggle to build and protect community was ongoing rather than finished. But she was ready for that now. Was no longer the invisible orphan girl trying to survive without being noticed. She was Clara Morgan of Dry Creek, someone who'd ridden into dust and fury to defend what mattered, who'd discovered that fire in her eyes when mercy demanded it, who'd learned that visibility had costs, but invisibility had worse ones. Whatever came next, she'd face it the way she'd learned to face everything, with the help of people who'd become family through shared struggle, with courage built from small choices that accumulated into transformation, with the knowledge that sometimes all you could do was show up and try and hope that trying was enough. The wind carried the smell of rain and dust mixed together, Texas telling its eternal story of harshness and survival, of people making homes in places that didn't offer easy living, but offered instead the chance to become more than they'd been. Clara breathed it in, claimed it as hers, and turned back toward town where lights were beginning to appear in windows, where life continued in all its difficult, beautiful, imperfect persistence. The dust remembered everything, but so did she, and remembering meant knowing not just where you'd been, but who you'd become along the way. That knowledge, more than water rights or agreements or any external security, was what would sustain her through whatever challenges tomorrow brought. She'd found her place not through luck or inheritance, but through choice, and that made all the difference in a world where so much was determined by forces beyond individual control. The orphan girl had become someone who belonged, and belonging was its own kind of victory, quiet but complete.